like to just introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name's Trevor Peterson. I'm a psychoanalytic counselor. I got my degree in that at the Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis. But I also got the doctorate in psychoanalysis and culture there. And I'm a clinician in private practice.
And we had communicated via email, and what we're looking to talk about today is just kind of some basic psychoanalytic concepts and how around a lot of conversations, psychoanalytic conversations, these terms might not be being used appropriately, or they might be not fully fleshed out. So I have some thoughts as to how to potentially dive into that, but I'm wondering if there's any place that feels right for you to start in that
Well, I was,
exploration.
I was going to ask you, Tom, I mean, do you have a psychoanalytic education? If somebody who's trying to understand these things, like, what's your basis for it? Like, did you have any training at an institute, or have you been kind of studying it on your own?
Yeah, so I have no formal psychoanalytic training outside of, um, I'm a mental health counselor. So we take a theories class, and it gives a really, I don't want to slander my program because I think my theories class was great, but it presents psychoanalysis as well as one can next to every other major psychotherapeutic school of thought. And I also have a bachelor's in psychology. And I will say that my undergraduate experience was perhaps could be argued to be slanderous towards
Yeah,
psychoanalysis,
can
not
you
just
say
not
a few
doing it
things about
due.
that? Like, what kind of slander was it? Like, was Freud a coke addict? Was
Well,
psychoanalysis like a antiquated, ancient, form of psychotherapy that's been disproven? Like, how did they represent it?
unscientific.
Okay.
Um, I would say dancing around the word debunked sometimes.
Hmm.
One thing that's kind of interesting and that came up a few times was the history of the seduction theory. And, my reading of what kind of happened uh, in Freud's career around that idea and his eventual revision of that idea versus how it was presented in school is very different. And perhaps I'm reading it wrong, or perhaps, but it really was presented several times in my undergraduate education as like, oh, Freud kind of abandoning abused young girls when my reading of Freud was he didn't say abuse wasn't happening. He was saying I don't think
Yeah.
every neurotic or person has been abused. So that is like sticks out of my mind as like kind of like a that's kind of like a slander, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, and even like psychoanalysts, like some of like the like newer American schools, like they'll say the same thing, like that Freud abandoned this and like went to all fantasy. But if you look at the introductory lectures, for example, like he always puts things in a dialectic, and like so in there he's like, no, like there is trauma, there's this stuff that happens in real life, but just like there's also these cases where like fantasy is the cause. And I see it like in my clinical practice, right? There was like a session like a couple of months back, like where like a woman um, got into this fantasy, that she was like in the city, and then there was like a sense of like a man that was following her, and then it kind of went to this sense that like he was aggressive, that it was going to go to like some kind of rape type of scenario, and um, and so for me it's like I think that like a lot of people would just take that and be like, oh, she must have had some real seduction or like rape or molestation in her past. But then when we ended up like kind of working through the fantasy, it's like she was identified with her mother, and she kind of had this sense that like, you know, this aggressive male can do something to her mother. And it like when she represented it in fantasy, it was rape. But then when we worked with it and got it back to a real life memory, it was like when her mom's boyfriend moved into the house, and before that, like, you know, just a single mother with her kids, and then like now the boyfriend's living there, and he has like the sense of like when the children should go to bed, you know, kind of changing the rules. And so it was more about seeing her mother in this subordinate place and like kind of losing her power. So again, like, you know, if you start just from the beginning, like I'm sure that there's a lot of like, you know, therapists who'd be like, oh, this must come from some real thing in your past, but it was really, again, identification with the mother. And the mother wasn't even like raped or sexually assaulted. It was just like a power. It was like coding the power differential between mom and like the boyfriend moved in. So just like, that's what I see is like, you know, important in Freud's theory, is that like, you know, when you kind of have these like fantasies that come up, like to say that they're always going to go back to like a real life trauma that happened to the person is just wrong, you know? And, but in no way at all does he ever abandon there's like real sexual abuse or real traumatic events. But that's like strangely how, like, you know, again, a lot of even psychoanalysts like want to represent it, right? Just Freud got it wrong. Freud made this major error. Freud, like, you know, we had to move away from him, but just it's not to be found in his texts. Like,
and recently I was listening. Oh God, I'm really hoping I don't misattribute this, but I think I heard this with an interview with I think his name is Peter Rollins on a podcast called Against Everyone with Connor Habib. That it was about you know, I had just done an episode with Todd McGowan about Lacan, and I wanted to hear someone else talk to someone about Lacan, and in that conversation. Rollins said, you know, like one of the problems with how Freud is presented is it's presented as he like just came out with this completed system, and people will poke holes or misrepresent that, but there's this evolving theory throughout his lifetime. And I feel like where a lot of the opportunities for perhaps motivated misrepresentation come from is the squashing of that, squashing like trying to flatten it all into one thing that can be then disputed in non-charitable ways, and even squashing the kind of literal and metaphorical elements of it, because, you know, as you're saying, like a lot of the way that the unconscious works is not it's not literal. It's through metaphor or through you know, a violation could be represented as a rape,
mm-hmm.
And how that ambiguity opens up vulnerabilities to being really misrepresented.
Yeah, yeah. And like I'd say, you know, like to say it's just metaphor, I think it's just like, you know, kind of is like a little bit whitewashing it. Like from me, like my understanding of Freud is that like, you know, it's always like, you know, a sense of like identification with others, like we're social animals first, and like, you know, and in the ego and the id, you know, he talks about it in terms of like, you know, that all character, like all our kind of rigidities and the patterns that we get into, right, like, you know, are always based upon identification. So it's just like, you know, to say be like a person who's like a compulsive workaholic, you know, and just like you're always trying to we're worried about being competent, being seen as adult and all those things like that. Being in that place, right, is like you're identifying with the parental imago or parental object, like where it's just like you're, you know, as a kid you saw your parents as more adults, more like knowledgeable, more competent, and then if you become that, right, then like in your real life you're going to be trying to act like that with other people. And so like it's not just a metaphor, there's like a whole system of like, you know, are you in the place of yourself, like, or are you in the place of the parental or sibling object, right? And you're trying to act that way with others. And I think that that's like, you know, for me, like that's the a major part of the Freudian unconscious, along with like the id and like, kind of the destructive drives and as you saw in the article, like, drives of restoration, like drives of affection, that you have towards the object. So it's always going to be object and these drives together. And, and I'd say that like, that's even though Freud isn't the best, as you're pointing out, at systematizing, like he has so many one-off articles or essays and kind of changes things. It's just like, trying to just collect those together. Like, I feel like I'm the systematizer. Like I'm the one who's trying to like take all these things and like put them together and say like, here's the coherent model that like I see in Freud's work. But a lot of other people, seem to be doing that in the most uncharitable way, like trying to make him into the straw man, right? He refutes the seduction theory and he only goes for fantasy. And it's like, nope, that's not there, So go ahead.
So, I think that opens up an interesting question of, okay, so let's say somebody was listening to this who just, maybe it's a college student, they just finished a Psych 101 class and there was a section on Freud, and you could probably guess what that section looked like, and
Mm-hmm.
there's the picture of the iceberg, and maybe like, yeah, a little bit too much time spent on the cocaine experiments, and and then like probably a paragraph at the end talking about how we move to a more empirically oriented psychology, and this, we have a debt of gratitude, but this is to be left in the past. So all of that, what would be your what would be the corrective that you would like to communicate to someone who just received that version of things?
Well, I've encountered that too when I've been invited to kind of give some talks at like the local university or in like past places I've lived. And it's like, the standard thing, right, is like the id wants to eat the ice cream cone and the superego says like, don't eat too much. And then the ego is like mediating between the two, and it's just like, and that kind of like view of it is so simplistic and so wrong, and so for me, like one of the like first things I kind of point out is like, the importance of the superego and like how this isn't like, just a theoretical thing. Like, there's the Oedipus complex and you internalize the parents, right? And then you have this like conscience, like apparatus afterwards. It's like for Freud, it's like the superego is defined.
I lost audio for you. Oh, you're back.
Okay. Um, all right. So,
You were saying there's this view of there's after you go, there's Oedipus complex, internalization of the maternal and paternal figures, and then there's conscious apparatus, and then you cut out.
okay. So yeah, so it's like, people just want to look at it in terms of like, well, this is like, nice theoretical conjectures, right? Like, that like, this is how you reference everything to the Oedipus complex and kind of like assert that conscience must form after that. But that's just not, like when he starts with the superego, like the idea is that the superego is like, I can observe myself, right? Like it's just a functional thing of like, I'm able to like have a view of myself and say like, I'm like, I'm unattractive, I'm lazy, I'm weak, I'm broken, like I'm pathetic, right? Like you could have this negative self-talk and you're looking at yourself in that way. And it can be conscience-based, right? Like I'm a bad person, right? Like I'm slimy, I'm gross, right? Like people have those moral views of themselves, but it's also just like, like I said initially, like just like it can be motivational, like I'm a weirdo, right? And you see yourself that way and you feel like you're an outsider. And like, so it's just the pure fact that we can look at ourselves and have some kind of judgment of ourselves. Like that is the superego. And so that's the idea between the ego ideal, right? Like that kind of the motivational part of us, like that we strive after certain goals, whether it's to be like, I want to be like the most powerful. I want to be seen as like a responsible and competent at my work. I want that view of me. I want to be seen as good. Like I'm like a helpful person to others, right? There's so many different types of motivations that we can have. But then when those things go like break down, right, in pathology, it's like then you can be stuck in these places where like, the client comes in and then it's just like, like I'm awful and nobody likes me, or like that like everything feels like it's too hard and I'm not strong enough. And just like that's a huge part of therapy, is like being able to figure out like, if it's not manifest, like what are the kind of secret, like, negative cognitions or bad self-criticism that this person has that stops them from living a fuller life, right? Because if you secretly think like I'm unattractive and nobody new will want me, then you stay in a bad relationship, right? It's like, well, this is the best I can do, is being with this person who we have all these problems with. So just like, again, like that's an empirical fact, like that we can do that. This is not like a big giant theoretical thing. It's just like ego is only, right? Like I can judge myself in various ways. And then from there, of course, he does try to hook it up to the Oedipus complex, right? And these different things, but just that's the main thing. It's like, like he's just drawing attention to like what is a straightforward fact about like how we function and how we can take ourselves as an object. And so like, that version of like the superego wants you to not eat the ice cream cone, right? Like, I mean, in some ways you can say the superego has like, you have an ideal of wanting to be attractive and you kind of can beat yourself up about, say, weighing too much, right? Not being in good shape. But like, that's just one aspect of it. There's so many different ways in which we look at ourselves.
So the superego can observe the self in reality and also observe the ego ideal and kind of see the gaps between them. And is that kind of what's happening? And kind of formulate the criticism there? Does the, because the superego is, it sounds like it's the seat of self-observation.
Yep, that's exactly how Freud defines it. Is like it is self-observation, and that self-observation can go to conscience, and you could be looking at yourself as shameful or guilty or bad, right? But it could also go into the motivational side, which is like, to judge oneself in terms of, strength, attractiveness, being good or like helpful or not, like being like belonging or not, or if you feel like an outsider, right? So just it goes both ways, but self-observation is the key. And again, he literally defines it that way, like in several texts. So it's strange to me that people have gotten to this point of like just trying to make it conscience or trying to make it just like this abstract theoretical thing when it's very practical. It is just this self-observation.
So if somebody, observes themselves and thinks, I'm a pretty nice person, is that a function of the superego as well? That kind of positive evaluation?
Yeah. So that self-observation, like we most notice it when it's self-critical, right? Like when you have these people that are coming in that see themselves in these very like, horrible, like, points of view, right? Like they're just like, I'm a monster. Like, I've had clients who produce images of like, I'm like, a puddle of goo or slime. Like that's what I am, right? Like, but self-observation also goes the opposite way, which is where you get into the idea of narcissism, right? Which is instead of looking at yourself as like bad potentially, or like, the normal person, right, just doesn't actually have many self-criticism like thoughts, right? Like, they're just like agents out in the world doing stuff, and they're not constantly going like, I'm this or I'm that. They're just kind of driven out there to interact with others. But with narcissism, right, you get the sense of like my self-observation is like I'm the best, that like, or like I'm, my way of doing things is the best way, and like, or like, everybody likes me, like, you see that a lot with like manic people, right? It's just they have that sense of like any interaction they do, it's like, the people were involved with must like them, that like, they were out with like so and so and like talking with their father, and their father really liked them, and they think that he's gonna like back them up on their new, pipe dream of like this new scam they have of getting money, right? And they just kind of immediately think like, I'm super lovable, right? And just people are they are disposed to like wanting to help me or go out of their way for me. But that could also be totally untrue, right? Like, it's just part of their manic narcissism, right? That they see themselves in that way.
So the superego is a function of self-evaluation, can be positive or negative, but you implied in a healthy person it's not super active. It's not really giving these evaluations one way or the other.
Yeah, yeah. Like, and Freud says that, like, when the superego, like, like in his book, The Ego and the Id, like a lot of people, I've read some commentaries where they're like, well, where's the superego in this? But like, Freud like sees the superego as part of the ego. He calls it a differentiating grade in the ego itself. And so and then he mentions in a few different like texts that just like when, they're combined, like when there's, when there is like healthy fusion between them, like you just aren't thinking about yourself and referencing yourself all the time. Right. And then just, you're just, again, living life. But then, it's when you become narcissistic, or, in some sense, like you become your own ego ideal, you become the parental object, right? Like then you need to see yourself as great or superior to others. Or if it breaks down and you become, you identify with the injured parental imago, or you identify with like, say the denigrated, form of the parent, like then you're stuck in these places where you only see yourself as bad. But I'd say that like, there's also a little bit of variation in there. Like in my 2018 book, I tried to point out that like, that there's, universal phases in different stages of development, like where like you have that sense of like, say a person could have like, say good confidence in themselves, but they're not necessarily narcissistic, right? Like some people, like they go out into the world and like they don't need to say like, I'm in a college town here, so I work with a lot of college kids, and and there's that sense of like, them going out to the bars, needing to get drunk, get some liquid courage, right? Like get drunk enough that they lower their self-criticism, right? So they can go out and approach like the opposite sex and talk to somebody. But then there's people that, can do that. They're confident and introduce themselves to strangers at parties, go up to people that they don't know and talk, but they're not necessarily narcissistic, right? And like when we see somebody who is, right, like if you work with that person who's trying to convince you about how great they are or how great their lives are, like, I make this much money, and like I have like this boat that I take to the lake, and I have all these things. Like if they have to prove something to you, like we wouldn't look at that as like confidence, real confidence, right? It's like they have to sell it to you. Like where that person who is naturally confident, like they just prove it in how they are and like how they interact with others, and they're not trying to like talk themselves up, right, or say anything. But just not everybody's like that, right? Like not everybody has that kind of confidence to go out and interact with others that way. And so there was the idea of that non-universal stage, or phase of development, like where I think I quote like Joyce McDougall. She talks about like the idea of like the mother or one of the parents, right? Kind of I hesitate to use the word seduction, right? But just like telling the child like you're good, right? Like you're like me. Dad is bad, right? Dad has these shortcomings, and so it's almost like a splitting of like the paternal like object, and then you take some of the authority or power it has, and then it's like granted to the kid because he thinks he's like more special now. He's like kind of got mom's love more than dad does, right? And then you have that, and then just like that translates into going out in the world and feeling differently. And so like with that, like the idea is that like if you've ever done group psychotherapy, right? Like a lot of people come in to that situation, like they have a natural deference to the facilitator, right? They kind of feel like, well, I want to hear what the facilitator has to say. And like they kind of have that sense of like looking up to you, and like, you know, they worry about being judged. But there's like some people who come in and it's like they kind of almost instantly like buddy up with the facilitator and start talking to, you know, him or her as if like, you know, they're on equal footing, right? Like, and you can see it too, like people in school, right, who went up to the teachers and tried to be the teacher's pet and be close to them, right? Like, that they like, there's some people who kind of have a different relationship to authority, and because they have like more of that confidence, and so they feel like, well, my opinions, right, or my ideas are just as equal as like my teachers, you know, where other people again have that natural deference of like, well, what does the authority say about this stuff? So there's like, you know, differences like that. You know, Freud talks about people who have what he calls a low ego ideal, right? Like where it's like, instead of having to prove, you know, in action achievement, right? Like I'm smart because I got these degrees and I showed my intelligence, right? Like I wrote this book or I created something, right? And that reflects back my worth. It's like there's lots of people, right, who have that sense of like, you know, like without say accomplishing much in the real world, like that they still feel like, oh, I'm pretty smart. Well, it's like, well, what have you done to show that, right? What have you done to prove that in some way? So like those areas, you know, are interesting to me because, you know, like I said, like being doing group psychotherapy and kind of noticing the difference between people that way. And then also, again, not just wanting to like be like instantly, you know, pathologizing, well, this confident person must be narcissistic. It's like, well, narcissism feels differently to me, like when I work with people who have it versus like this type of person, you know? So there's just, as the self-observation, right? Like, you know, in the self-criticism function of the superego, there's a differing sense of like, you know, what you have to live up to, like what you have to do in order to, you know, be good, to be strong, to be like live up to your ideals in some way. And some people, like, you know, they have to prove quite a bit to themselves, you know, and other people, they feel more like, no, like I got this, like I'm pretty smart. I don't have to get a degree to reflect that, or like, you know, have some achievement. So there's interesting differences all within there. And Freud, you know, like I said, has like some stuff in there that like, you know, really kind of inspired me to try to like get into this and take it apart more and kind of understand like, well, what are these differences, and how would you like comprehend them when you're trying to see different types of people?
So there's a few things going on there, and I want to try to make sure I'm understanding correctly. But I do want to say where you started off, the way you were describing narcissism, which I find such a kind of elusive, hard to grasp term, and especially because like the first like proper psychoanalytic text I read was Kohut was and so like I was like, well, what is this narcissism that is like keeps kind of being talked about? It was so beyond what I could grasp, and so much of the language was unfamiliar. But the way you describe it is I think one of the clearest I've heard it described. Of it is, it's just a lot of self-evaluation. It's just superego. It's just self-evaluation in the positive usually, but um, and that the difference between someone with who's kind of narcissistic is they're spending more time in that self-evaluative, in kind of a maybe defensive way, or at least a positive way, versus someone who's not as narcissistic is just not self-evaluating quite as much.
Yeah, well, again, but you could be self-evaluating as like, you know, in a negative way, right? Like that I'm weak, like I'm a coward, right? Like I have a lot of people that come in that you know, see themselves in that way, and like, you know, are be kind of almost become afraid, right, to like really try hard, um like for example, like, you know, with some people, right, there's that sense of like they're again college students, and like and they have these papers to get in, but then there's that sense of like procrastination with some of them, where it's just like, you know, if I I give myself enough time and write like a paper that's like as the best paper I could possibly write, and then the teacher criticizes it, like that's going to hurt, right? Like, so like if I kind of wait to the last minute to write my paper and do it, like stay up the night before, and then I hand it in, it's like, hopefully I get a good grade. But then if it's like, if it's the teacher criticizes it, like, then it's like, it's not my best work. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, there are these ways in which people kind of try to like manage their self-esteem in life, and kind of playing little games with themselves and with others. But the narcissist, right, who's like just simply like, I'm the best, right? It's like, so they want to cultivate this self-image of like, I'm seen as superior, people admire me, people look up to me. And then like, so when they're like dealing with people in their lives, right, it's like they'll have like the sycophant, right? Like they'll have like people who are like, yeah, you are the best, right? Like who like look up to them and give them that admiration, and they'll stay away from others who don't, right? Who don't agree with that self-evaluation. And so just like, that can lead to a lot of withdrawal, because you have to manage like how much like input you get from others. It's not controlled, right? It's not going to be from these like people who are going to give you that admiration. But like the Freudian way, right, is like, that like you become, again, the parental imago. Like you identify with like the picture of the parents as like they're more perfect, they are stronger, they're better, right? And you become that, and then you are trying to manage like other people to make sure that you get that reflection back to you that way.
And sorry, and the parental imago. The imago, if I'm understanding right, is kind of like an interject, right? Is it synonymous with that, or is it a little different?
Well, so it's just the term is like you can say internal objects,
Okay.
like, but just in Freud's text, that's what he calls it. He's like, the parental imago is what like you internalize. It becomes a part of your psychic structure, right? Like this is not like an accident or something that is like, some people have and some people don't have, right? All of us have it, and it's part of this function of self-observation. Like you internalize the imago, in the Oedipus complex, and then as part of your psychic structure, it like allows you to like look at yourself from the place of the ideal, right? Like you look at yourself and evaluate like how you're doing, that way. And so it's just like, so to say that you become it, right, like just means that you take on that superior parental place, and you look at yourself in whatever kind of positive ways, like it that's relevant for your ego ideal. Because, right, like I often use the term like, fighter and lover. I was like, I have some clients that come in and be like, hey, like, you're not a fighter, you're a lover. And like, it's hard for you to like say no to other people, hard for you to keep boundaries. Like if somebody upsets you, you stuff your anger and you don't say it out loud, right? It's just not natural for them to kind of have access to their aggression and their assertiveness, where there's some people who are fighters, and it's just like, competitive, like they want like a sense of mastery, a sense of self-reliance, and like they're focused on that. And it's hard for them to be like vulnerable and soft and let out feelings. Right. And just like, and then for Freud, right, like in my work, I cashed it out as like, that's the active aggressive pole versus like the passive, like belonging pole, right? Like you have people who are power based, and you have people who are more concerned with like belonging, love. And like, that's like two different ways it can go. And so the power ideal is, right, to be the smartest, the strongest, the most beautiful, right, to have the best taste, right? Like there's people out there that are always concerned about appearing that way, right, or like having that. And then the people on the loving side, right, they're more concerned with like, am I making this other person feel welcome? Like, am I being nice, right? Like, they're just in the world in a very different way. And so like based on those different ideals, right, like, you become to become the parental imago or object, right, is just like, you can be like, power based and like, I'm the most powerful, but you could also be on the other side. You can be like, I'm like the most like loving, right? Like I'm caring and I'm compassionate, and like I help everybody that I see. Like a lot of addicts, will often like use this phrase, like, I'd give the shirt off my back to anyone. And they kind of had that like pride in themselves, right? That like, I'm a caring person, I'm a good person. and with that, you kind of, if you become that good object and you defend and become the good parental object, like in some ways it's very hard to, again, like access your assertiveness, access like boundaries, and because you're supposed to always be this font of love for everyone. And so like that is getting into like that split in the paper of narcissism and egoism, right? Like where it's like, to become the parental object and this side is different than this side, and how does that show up in like issues with, like, I guess, interpersonal or interpsychic interactions with others that are problematic, because like, like if you're too nice all the time, people can walk all over you, right? Like if you're, and that's what, like, you can find with a lot of people who've just given into depression, is that like a lot of them will talk about like how they were just like used by others or walked all over, and they get to this place like where instead of being the good parent, becoming that and like being like loving to everyone and helpful, they just kind of like go down to like becoming the dead parent, and they're just empty, they're depressed, they're withdrawn, and they don't want to be the good one anymore because they just got shat on, like,
So
so
both, sorry,
go ahead.
but both narcissism and egoism are both, they're different strategies taken by one who is spending an excess amount of time and energy in that self-evaluative function. They both kind of have the same underlying problem of too much, too much time in this super egotic process of looking at oneself, evaluating oneself, judging oneself.
Well, I would say again, it's like the unconscious girding of this, right? Is like you became the parental object, right? In both cases, you became that, and then in that, the self observation function, right, is like starting to say like, well, I have to be my image that I cultivate to others has to be this all the time, right? Like, so if you have somebody who's like, narcissistic, and they have to be perfect, like you can see them, they don't try new things. Like, I'm not gonna, try to play this. I remember one client who wouldn't play chess. His friend wanted to play chess, but it's like he doesn't want to play chess, be new at it, lose because he's new at it, and have to practice and get better. If he's not going to be perfect in it, he doesn't want to do it, right? And so that's very limiting for a person, right? Like to be in like this identification, and like I said too, with the echoist, who's the good parental object, right? It's like, like to be in there, like you could have them that like, it's not uncommon that I'll have like a client who's like in university and who's like made multiple plans. Like, oh, this person wanted to hang out, and I said yes, and the person hang out, and they have like 3 or 4 different plans that they have to do because they just couldn't say no to anybody, right? And it's just like, and then that's at some point that's going to blow up in their face, because it's just like, if you can't say no and make those boundaries, it's just like, that at some point you're, like somebody's going to get upset with you, like, hey, like we were hanging out tonight, like what's going on? Why are you leaving so early? Or like, why are you canceling last minute? Like just these kinds of things that they end up doing.
So the parental imago, it's not a realistic snapshot of a parent. It's some perfected or idealized form of them. And for the echoist, it is of this benevolent and accommodating parent, whereas for the narcissist, it is more of this. I feel like I'm getting this wrong, but almost like aesthetically perfect and ultimately competent version of the parent.
Yeah. Like, so in one of the articles I sent, like I try to make a small differentiation, right, of like the people who think they are the best in every way, right? Like I'm the best, versus like I'm the best at doing something, right?
Hmm.
And so like I kind of try to say like there's these two forms of becoming the parental object in narcissism, and just but yeah, it's the idea is like it's that when we're going through psychosexual development, we're kind of making this Freud calls it like, this negative view, right? Of like perfection isn't something real, right? Perfection isn't something like I could point to like, oh, if you listen to this song or if you eat this food or like something like I can show you the pattern of perfection in there. Like there's no like innate perfection you can see and you can point to in others. And as people know, like what we think is perfect changes like as we get older, right? So like, for young kids, it's like, oh, this transformer or this dinosaur or like, these things that I see them as perfect, or I like wrestling and I see like this strong guy as like, as perfect. But then later, as you mature, it's like, well, I don't see the same types of things as like perfect that I used to, right? Like now, say my ideal of like what perfection is like not just like the super strong wrestler, right? But it's just like, it's a guy who's got more intelligence and maybe like, like is maybe a detective on TV or something. And he's like my new idea of what's perfect. So like for Freud, it's like in childhood development, we have this negative view, and negative, not like as in positive negative, just like in the sense that perfection doesn't have real content. It's just a placeholder that we make. Mm-hmm. And like, and in the earliest development, like the most perfect thing is God, right? Like there's this sense of like the ultimate sense of the most idealized perfection, and some people kind of place that on God in culture. Others don't. Like you don't have to, but just like there's that sense of like that being, like the being that's all perfect, all good, all knowing, omniscient, omnipotent, right? And then from there we have like lesser magnitudes of like seeing like say people in society, like there's the idea of like the genius, right? Or somebody like that people can look up to as a hero, like, oh, like Einstein or like, some writer like, Dostoevsky or Beethoven, right? Like these people who are world historical and like every culture knows them and they'll go down in history. And like, and that's another view of perfection, that we have in us, that we, again, like will take on things from our culture. And then it keeps on going down to the point like where it's like, well, there's like people who are in like Harvard or like, these like really famous schools, and somebody who's like a graduates or is a professor there, right, is like they must be really smart, right? And so like that's another view of perfection, and it goes all the way down to like bosses and educators and people in our community, where it's just like we don't see them as like, oh, this guy, my high school math teacher is Einstein. Like we don't, you know what I mean? Like you still can look up to him as knowing something, but he's not that idealized. And so like, those things, those views of perfection at these differing levels are in us. And then some people's narcissism is megalomania, right? Like, they can literally get to the point where they're like, I am God, I am Jesus, right? Like, or, like that's obviously there with psychotic people who say those things. But like how it usually plays out in the clinic, right, is you'll have somebody who can make no mistakes. They're not allowed to make any mistakes. And so like if they do something wrong, they're always like blaming somebody else, right? Like, well, I tried to do this, but you got in the way, or you did this. Like they're always trying to kind of have this, like that self-observation is like, I didn't do anything wrong. Like I'm blameless. Like I'm good. And this thing got in the way. And then, but not everybody again is at that megalomanic like level of like, I'm God. Like some people are just like at that, like, smaller level of like, I'm pretty important in my field, right? Like, I'm not like as important as Freud or Lacan or some other big name, but like, but they can see themselves as like, people look up to me and my work is important to others. And that could be the case, but it could also just be their narcissism that they believe that. And then again, if it's their narcissism, then they don't like to say, go to conferences and go out into like the public, because then somebody might ignore them or make them feel, right, like that they're not as important as they feel they should be.
And if let's say that it is somebody who is pretty accomplished in their field or something like that, if they're not in this narcissistic or egoist mode of self-evaluation, they're neither denying or affirming that. It would be my guess, right? They're just kind of like, yeah, that might be true.
Yeah, and that like it's interesting because like Aristotle in his Ethics like has this idea of like magnanimity and this idea of like self-evaluation being proper, right? Because you could have people who are like, say, good contributors or like important, like adding important work to the field, but they don't see themselves as that way. You know, they're like kind of like, well, yeah, I guess I wrote this paper, but I got lucky. You know, like they'll be self-effacing and kind of put it down and not realize that they're more important than they are. And then you can have the people who again see themselves as much more important than they are. So like, you know, those things like, you know, they're tricky for some people. And I would say that you're right that like, you know, if they're not in narcissism or egoism, they're just kind of like, I'm just doing this and like, yeah, and I have these external things. I won this award, right? I have like this position in my institute or at a university, and like, and I take some pride in that. Like I earned that, and I did that. And it's not, but it's not like they're looking at themselves as so much greater than that, right? They're just like, I have this, it's good. And again, they don't think about it that much. They have normal confidence.
So, it's been posited that post World War II, those issues have become much more common in the West and specifically in the United States. These kind of more narcissistic problems of self evaluation, of people running into trouble from too much investment in self. I don't know where you stand on that, but either way, it's something that does pop up. And how is that treated psychoanalytically?
Well, so the first thing I'd say is like, I disagree with that. I think that, you know, like one of the reasons that Freud was able to go back to like Greek myths is because like you could have all those problems there. You know, you could have all these like same interpersonal problems of like narcissism and egoism, all these things like in any culture. And to say that like, you know, maybe like there's the idea that like, you know, that there's like a certain client culturally, like it comes to the fore, like maybe there could be something like that. But like, even like to say like, you know, it's not like hysterical conversion symptoms went away after like, you know, Freud's Victorian age. Like again, maybe they weren't as prominent because of the, you know, like, you know, Victorian sexual taboos, right? And all these things that were there that might be generating them, right? Like having to stay in this loveless marriage. A lot of marriages were still arranged, right? Like where like, you know, to kind of open that up and have it that like that stuff was like, say like a more of a choice of the person that could have changed, say the amount of people that was happening to, but like none of it went away, and all of it, you know, like you can still say like there's definitely like, you know, read Plato, right? And you'll still see instances of like narcissism in there, like, you know, and talking about different types of people. Like, so I just would say it's just like kind of, you know, that's like part of the kind of postmodern influence, right? Like that we want to just talk about like what is like the new subject that's out there and like what is discourse creating. But I just think that there's not really much content to that. You know, when it comes down to it, it's just like, you know, like what is the American subject? Like, you know, like we live in such a polarized time. It's like there's not just one type of American, right? Like there's like liberal, there's conservative, you know, and then there's like Democrat and then like super progressive person, right, who believes in like all the, you know, anti racism woke stuff, right? And then there's the kind of classic old school Republican, and then the Trump follower, right? Like there's just all these types. Like to say that like there's one, you know, message of discourse that's infecting all of us and making us a certain way, like I just don't see it. Like what's the evidence for that? Like, you know, and like and so like I think that, you know, more so I see that as probably like the narcissism of like, you know, those like American schools post Freud, right? Is that they want to see like that they're doing something new or getting into something new. And so they're going to like talk about it that way. Like, you know, like Kohut famously, right? It's like Freud only talks about guilty man. I'm talking about tragic man. Right. And it's just like, but like, there's definitely tragic man in Freud's writings, and like, and, you know, that's not new, right? To say that, you know, the tragic life of like the alcoholic gambler, right? Who's like trying to, you know, make a living that way and do that. Like, you know, like that didn't just come into like America in the 1950s, like when Kohut was around. Like there was gamblers in the past, right? There were people who had that kind of psychic structure that way, that they're impulsive and, you know, they're not showing say commitment to like a job or relationships that's like really lasting, right? They're kind of just going around and to different places and living this kind of way, like nomads, like, you know, that's nothing new. Like, and like when we look at the old myths, right, or Shakespeare, right, like, you know, like we see tragic characters in Shakespeare all the time. I mean, like, you know, that they have this ambition to become the king and then like the tragedy of everything falling apart. Like, so it's just strange that, like, you know, that people want to give so much credit to that stuff and aren't seeing the universal patterns that are underneath it.
So yeah, you reject the idea of kind of like this generational pathology. That said, narcissism, egoism, these, they do exist as you are expressing. Maybe not in any greater number than in the days of Freud, but so I'm wondering because specifically, like, so many schools of thought within psychotherapy outside of psychoanalysis uh, will focus on negative self-evaluations. um, you know, Usually at a pretty surface level, talking about these cognitions, disputing these cognitions. That's I'm not really being fair. Like, that's, a caricature and not what CBT looks like these days. Really, usually. But um, there's how does one work with narcissism and egoism? This just in general, this tendency to self-evaluate, to focus on self, to not really be able to turn one's eye away from themselves, psychoanalytically. What does curing that or resolving that look like?
So what I'd say with that is that, like, you know, there's a classical way of working psychoanalytically, right? Like, you know, that involves the transference. And so just like the normal, like, person would give you an answer there, right? Like, you got to wait for these things to come in. And then, like, and then there's a chance that you might be able to kind of like get into it and play that out. Like, so for me, like, I definitely like work with the transference. Like, it's important. It's inescapable. It's going to come in at some point. You know, that you realize that the person has like some kind of feeling in the room with you and seeing you in a certain way, or they're thinking that you're thinking certain thoughts about them, right? But just like for me, like I kind of cut my teeth as a therapist working with like addiction. Like, you know, I had to get my supervision hours in a clinic, and they, of course, like they load you up with like the worst cases. Like, you know, here's the, you know, you're basically forced to do some indentured servitude for a while, and here's like, you know, the hardest cases that nobody wants to work with, you know. And so for me, it's like I kind of started to innovate techniques, because it's like, you know, like again, transference will come in, and some people have it right away, right? Like they come in and they're immediately hostile. Like, you know, somatics will come into like, you know, the say group psychotherapy setting and be like, oh, like you only have book knowledge, you don't know what life is really like, you know, and they'll kind of instantly try to push back on you. But for some people, right, like it's like, you know, they just met you. Why would you be so important to them? Right? Like, you know, you have to like show that you can understand them, listen to them for a while. And then like, once you prove yourself, then you'll start to mean something to them. Right. And you maybe start to show up in dreams, or they start to have like, you know, a common thing, right, is like, you know, a client will tell me like, oh, and then I was thinking like, and then Trevor was in my head and he was saying this, right? Like you can start to kind of exist for them in that way. But that doesn't happen right away, you know? And then, so for me, it's like trying to work with this stuff and get into it, like knowing that I'm not yet that significant to them, right? And like, and so just like, who are the significant people in their life? And then trying to see like, well, what's going on with those relationships and these problems that like we can get into. And so like the whole idea identification like with the parental imago, right? I would say that like knowing some Freud, like, well, knowing a lot of Freud, because like we were forced to read a bunch at the school I went to. It's like, you know, I had these basic ideas, right? Like say Mourning and Melancholia, right? This, that, like he has that sense of that you the examples are like, you have the person who like, the loved one who dies, or you have like the woman who's like jilted at the altar. She's going to get married and then her fiance leaves. And then you have this like angry view of them, angry criticism or judgment of them. But again, because of like being a lover and not a fighter, right? Because you're kind of more on the side of this, like the, of the passive side of the ego instead of the power active side, right? Like you want to love primarily, and then when you see these things that like make you upset with the person, like it's hard to be upset with them. And so instead of getting super angry with like, the fiance who left you at the altar, like you have that anger come up, you repress it because it's too overwhelming, and then you identify with them, right? You become them in your ego in some way, and then so you start to like criticize yourself, like I'm selfish, right? Like I'm bad, like all the things that could be said about the fiance, you're saying about yourself. And so when I work with this stuff with people, it's like, it's often to kind of say like, well, I know they're an identification with the parental object, right? And just to be clear, right? Like when we love somebody, the whole idea, the Oedipus complex, like, is like that our parental, our caregivers, like they're our first view of authority, our first view of like what friendship would look like, if they're going to play with us and do stuff with us, our first view of like somebody we love. Right. But then it's not like you just want to have sex with your mother, right? Like the idea is that like that internalizing the parental imagos, like having that in us, now we start to like transfer that onto people out in the world, right? So like when you love somebody, like you are putting them in the place of the parental imago, right? Like they're part, like you put the ego ideal onto them and you see them as more ideal than yourself, and you love them, for that. And so like when you have somebody you love in your life, like nowadays they're in that place. And so when something goes wrong, right, like you defend and you still become the parental imago, right? You kind of like where you put it on them, it didn't work out. Again, like you had big feelings, whether it was big sadness, rejection, betrayal, hurt, anger. You repress that, and then you become the imago rather than dealing with the feelings. If I become the parental imago, then I don't have to stay with my feelings of being hurt by it, right? Like I am it. And that's again what Freud says is always underlying all character stuff. And so when I'm in the place of this, like of the parental imago, then I'm looking at myself as bad, right? As I had judged the other person to be. And so with that, right, like just a normal, simple way to do that is I'll have somebody who's evaluating themselves in these ways as bad. And then I'll say like, so you say, you're selfish. You say that like you're uncaring. You say that like that you're all these bad things. If you take those statements and you say that about somebody from your past, like who's the first person who comes up? And so it's just like, so I'll always elicit these negative cognitions, and then I'll be like, so, and then who have you seen that way before in that light? And then we can get back to like, well, I saw, my fiance that way. Right. And then once we're in there, it's like, how much can they stay with that feeling of seeing them in that light? How much can they get to say the anger or the hurt? And then sometimes like they can access it right away, but then oftentimes there's a block or there's a defense against that. There's resistance. Right. So like as they're, say talking about the fiance who jilted them, right? Like, it's like, if they get to the anger, I'll be like, okay, so I could hear in your voice as you're talking about them, I can kind of hear the anger coming across. Now, where do you feel it in your body? And then they'll often be able to say like, I feel it in my hands, like, right, I can feel the anger in there, my power's in there, right? Or I feel it in my jaw, or I feel it in my eyes, or I feel it in my chest. Like there's some kind of bodily zone that they hold that goes along. It's not just affect. It's not just emotion. Like this is the Freudian id, right? So when we get into these things, it's like, okay, you feel it in your hands. Now I want you to kind of close your eyes and just see like, if you're going to express it from your hands, like, how does this want to come out? And then they'll say like, I feel like I want to choke the other person, or I want to like make my hand into a fist and I want to hit them. Right. So there's just that level of getting into the physicality of the id. And then, but again, it's very common too, that like, to lead this person back to that moment, they'll kind of talk about it and they know that there's a feeling there, but then they can't access it in their body. They don't know where they're holding on to it, or, that they start to talk about them in an angry way, but then they're like, oh, but like his mother was so horrible to him, and she like and his past was so bad, and they'll start minimizing, what this person did, and start kind of almost start like, taking the accountability and the proper blame this person should have, and they take it away and they start to own it. Like I wasn't, like I was like, in college at the time, and I wasn't as present as I should have been. And so again, like they'll have all these different ways in which they don't want to access the repressed feeling towards this person. And then you got to work with those. And like right away with people, like those blocks, those resistances are just as important as getting into that repressed, feeling towards them. Plus, like I said, like getting to that id impulse. Where do you hold it? Like, what do you want to do in your anger to the person? Right. So that's
And
good.
and what do you do with it once you are once you're no longer repressing it and you have this hatred or anger towards someone that feels unacceptable and you were previously, turning towards yourself? I mean, what does one do?
Well, so I mean, that's a matter, right, of some people like in say like in some forms of psychoanalysis say like, well, you never get rid of these drives, right? Like you have this like aggressive drive for this person, right? And just like, you have to like sublimate it, right? Or you have to do something with it. But there's definitely other schools, right? There's like, no, if you get to the feeling, right? If you get to that sense of like that anger you felt towards the other person, and you're able to like discharge it, right? Like, so if it's in the transference, if I become like the bad fiance in the transference, and the person's able to like verbalize it and say it, talk about how awful I am and get upset, like they discharge it, they get it out, and they're no longer having to defend and become the object. They can go back to the place of themselves, right? Express it, and then they don't, and then it's just done. It's gone. It's discharged, like in the relationship to me. And like I said, like that it's important. That has to happen with a lot of things, that they have to come into the transference. But with what I do is like, again, before it comes into the transference, I'll get them to work with it in imagination, right? So I'll say like, so you feel it in your body, like, you feel it in your hands and you want to choke this person. So just like in your mind's eye, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to like, picture them, and then like picture them in that memory where you felt like the most hurt from them, the most anger. And then just like in your mind's eye, like, call them all the names you want to call them, verbalize it to whatever extent you need to, and put your hands on their throat and choke them. And just see like, how far do you want to go? Like, is this a real like death wish? Like that you want to hold on to their throat, and you're picturing that, viscerally feeling that in your imagination, like right as you're doing this. And you can see when people have their eyes closed and they're doing this, like their bodies are still moving. Like when we imagine something, there's still a visceral connection to the body that's going on with that. And then they'll sometimes do it like, yeah, like they'll stop afterwards and they'll be like, yeah, I choked this person, like they're dead on the ground. And so I'll say like, look at the dead body, like look at like whatever, when you've access to your aggression, your power, and you've had this effect on them, look at that and start to see like, how does your body feel? And so it's just like, and then afterwards it's like the anger that they felt, has kind of like melted away. Their hands don't feel like the same as they used to. And then they've kind of like gotten rid of the repressed impulse. And so again, then they don't have to go into identification with the object. They can just stay in this place, and then the self-criticism goes away.
And what about the other side of the coin? Because that sounds like the self-criticism. If I'm understanding, that is egoism. I mean, that's a way that it manifests, right?
Yeah.
What about? And I imagine that clinically, I mean, like practically, it looks the same, but the mechanisms might be different. Working with somebody who's more narcissistic, more grandiose, and self-protective in that way.
Yeah. So there's a night and day difference. Like I expressed earlier, right? With like egoism, or people who are lovers, right? Like, or have bad boundaries, right? Like can't say no to others. Like they can often, or very quickly, very early on, tolerate like working like, in this like space of like fantasy and imagination, and they can like, kind of invite you into their internal worlds like relatively quickly, but with somebody who's narcissistic, like again, like they're brittle, like they have identified with the parental imago, like they're grandiose, or they think they're superior or better, but like you can't just get straight into this world with them, because it's like they don't share that world. Like they are fundamentally afraid inside, right? Like superiority always covers up that inferiority, and if you try to get in there, you're going to trigger them that way to get into these like feelings of inferiority, and they just like they while they're like criticize you, shoot something back, they won't show up again, right? Like, so you can't get in there right away. And one of the things that I learned at my school, which is like a modern psychoanalytic school, like which is like modern as a specific school name, right? Like it's like Hyman Spotnitz, was that you can't interpret, you can't kind of bring these people back to like those like bad feelings, because if you do that, like they can't tolerate it at all. And so so with those people, like I'll have to spend like like oftentimes like months, like just kind of giving them like the reflection they need, like kind of feeding their egos, like say like like I said, I work with a lot of addicts, and so I'll have this guy who's like a drug dealer or something like that, right? And who's like grandiose, thinks that he's like smarter than everyone, thinks that he's like really superior and special. Doesn't want to just work a normal job while he's on probation, because he was making $20,000 a weekend selling meth, and so like the idea of like being out of jail and just working a normal job, he chafes under it constantly, but like for somebody like that, it's like I'll have to spoon feed their ego. So it's just like they'll tell me their story, and I'll be like wow, I'm surprised you didn't make it like further along in the criminal organization you were in than you did, like, or like I'm surprised you got caught there, just like kind of giving them that like admiration they need, giving them that positive image of themselves that they need, and then waiting for them to like bring in some of the issues and problems, right? And if I can kind of like let them have that sense that I'm observing them like they need their self-observation to be, like then at some point they'll bring in like, oh, like yeah, I got this problem with my girlfriend, or like this thing, and they'll start to give you some content that you can get it. But again, just like it's very slow and gradual, and for them especially, like you have to wait for the transference to come in. Like if you try to be too active with some of these other techniques, like they just again, they don't want to feel the inferiority, and like to make them feel that, like they'll push back a lot. So,
and in that work, is there a process internally that moves them out of that self-evaluative mode, and what is that process? What's kind of going on?
So again, it's the same mechanism of like anything that's like whenever you're superior, or whenever you're like again in this place that you're bad, or you have to be good all the time, or whatever it is, there's always the identification with the object. And so with these people, right, like so say for example, like they start to bring up like some of their problems, we get into it, and then I start to notice they have this resistance, right? Like we associate, we're trying to get things back to that traumatic moment. They repress these feelings and identified with the parental object, right? And then and I could tell that like they're there, they've gone back, and they don't like these feelings. So what I'll do with them is I'll say like, okay, like there's a part of you that's obviously pushing back on this, a part of you saying, no, I don't want to feel these things. So where do you feel that in your body? And then so say, for example, they'll tell me they feel it in their chest, and I'll be like, okay, so feel into there. Like, and when you feel in there, does it feel hot or cold? Does it feel like solid, like liquid, like gas? Like what's the quality of the feeling in there? And I'll get them to make me a power image. So like, say like, for example, they'll be like, the way it feels inside, like, this power part of me pushing back on this, saying no. I see like a really tall, strong bodybuilder, and he's just like ripped with muscles. And next thing I'll say is like, okay, so if you superimpose that, like take that image of the big bodybuilder, and you kind of like close your eyes and you picture yourself kind of like becoming that size, becoming that big, and like how right does that feel to kind of feel like yourself becoming that, like this image? And then they'll say like, yes, it feels right. And then I'll say, okay, now I want you to picture yourself as this bodybuilder, and just see like who makes you feel this way the most, or with who do you feel this like the sense the most? Like, when you're at work, like, do you feel like that you're constantly like this bodybuilder there? Do you feel it with like, like a romantic partner? Do you feel it with like a parent? And so like, for example, like, I'm just taking this from like somebody I saw last week. So they were the bodybuilder. They felt it almost everywhere, like except with their kids. And so like I got them to picture themselves at work, and I was like, so if everybody at work saw you this way, instead of just seeing like the normal way that you look, they saw this giant bodybuilder, like what would they think about that person, right? And it's just like, and they're like, you're big, you're tough, you're scary. Like I want to run away from you, right? They have all these senses of how these people would see them in that way, right? And so we know again that they're the parental imago, right? That they're the tough, stronger, like superior, larger than life. And so when you elicit those statements that they see, how they see other people looking at them, then I'll say, okay, now when you say those statements about somebody from your past, like who comes to mind, right? That you saw them as like, you're strong, you're scary, right? Like I want to run away from you. And then oftentimes again, like that can go back to like a parental figure early on. It could also go to an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend that's not, in the deep childhood past, that like somebody they saw that way, when they were dating in their 20s, right? Or something. But just like, and then, so we undid the identification with that, with the parental object. Now they're back in these memories when they saw somebody as like the perfect object, as scary, as strong, right? And it's like, then we get into that, and it's like, well, how much can they start to access the feelings there, right? Or again, are more blocks going to come in? Because sometimes they do. But if you could undo that identification with the object, right, and take them back to when they saw somebody that way, like then you'll undo that like narcissism or egoism inside of them. And then they're going to be able to just be in the normal subject place without becoming the object, right? So like that underlies everything in like Freudian, like, the Freudian model. And if you can find the way of like, like where this goes back to, and again, build up the alliance, like say with the narcissistic person, get inside where you're giving them the reflection, the mirroring, and not again, making them too defensive, right? Not making them feel the unwanted emotions too much. And then they let you in, and then they can tolerate that, being in that, again, that weak place, that like that inferior place to that person, and then get rid of the emotions, discharge the id, right? And then undo that, and then that can stay. But I don't want to give you the sense that it's just one session, right? As if like we're just getting down to one session and then all of a sudden they're cured. Like it's like, when somebody comes in, there's like, for me, there's always like 3 phases. It's like at first they have like, say their OCD or anxiety or depression or something, and we work with the symptom to begin with. And then we start to get like deeper into this character pathology of them being a narcissist or an egoist. And then we're kind of taking away all the objects that they have, right? All the identifications they have, because there's not just one self, right? Like in Freud's model, like, again, there's all those superegos of like, perfection like God, perfection like this, with Einstein or some like super genius, all these things. And so like they have a lot of these identifications that they made with differing objects in this way, and you have to go through and slowly undo them all. And then at the last stage, you're trying to integrate their opposite pole, right? So if they're the egoist who has to be caring and loving, and they can't be assertive for themselves and they can't be aggressive, then we're gradually getting to like their power side and starting to integrate that with them so that they, have access to like healthy assertiveness, healthy like sense of like, hey, I could ask my boss for a raise, I deserve it, right? Like as opposed to it's presumptuous, I can't ask my boss, like he has to just like, evaluate my work and decide that I'm good enough, and then he'll offer me one if I am. But it's just like, that's not the way that capitalism works. It's not the way that the world works, that you can just count on like, your boss is a good, caring person. He's going to see that and give that to you. And if you can't access that stuff in you, like it's going to very much limit your career, And so like, in that final stage, like after undoing enough of the identification, you have to start to get that merger with the other side. And it's hard. Like, it's very hard. Like, in my experience, as I try to integrate people at that last stage, it's like the other side, like, so if they're an egoist, then their power pull is bad. Like the idea of them having power is bad. And like, so some clients have had dreams about like Charlie Manson or like some serial killer, right? Like, and that like, and like to get into their power side, they're going to like take on all the, all it's not just power, it's like power mixed with evil, and they're going to let this evil thing back into themselves and they don't want to do it. And that'll always go back to like, like a person, everybody has their power and their belonging sides, but like at some point in their childhood or their teenager years, whatever it was, right? Like their power side, like, they say, had a bad relationship and, and got to like, death wishes, like literal, like, Oedipal homicidal feelings towards somebody. So of course they had to repress their power side, because if they didn't, like, they would have been staying like with these feelings of like, I want to kill this person, and the opposite side, right? Like when you have that narcissist and they get into their belonging side, like I like with one client, I ended up like, taking some of his interest in comic books, and we talked about it as like the Batman and Joker, right? So like Batman's not, like I'm the best, like, a grandiose narcissist in that sense, but it's like, it's more like he's definitely like, like a person who's concerned with like mastery, his own power, knowing everything about everyone, having all the fighting styles and gadgets, like everything he needs, right? And like he has this lonely existence where it's like everything's about like, keeping all these people safe, and like, and all he does is like watch, what I mean? Like, watch the criminal monitors to see what action's going on, and he has like no personal life, no feelings at all. No, like, he can impersonate Bruce Wayne once in a while and pretend him, make him out to be this like foppish, like decadent, like rich guy, just to draw attention away from himself. But like, you get no real personal relationships. And so for him, right, like when he gets into his idea of like my belonging, me as a loving person, me like in relation to others, it's like, it appears to him like the Joker. Like it's just like chaos. It's crazy, right? Like to get into all these feelings and to like get into like that side of myself is just like too much. Like I'd be a clown, right? I'd feel like a clown. And so like that final stage of integration for the narcissist, right, is like they have to kind of work with that image of like, not just again, like just having feelings and being vulnerable. It's like, it's turned into this bad thing where it's just like feelings are crazy, and they often like kind of project that onto other people, right? Like I'm the normal husband who's going to my work, and like, and my wife, she has all these crazy emotions I have to manage, right? Like that craziness is projected onto others. And it's like, what's really your own craziness? That's what your own feelings became, because like you repressed that pull of yourself, because it's like, you felt like if I let myself stay in this place, like it's unmanageable, right? Like I'm going to be lost in these feelings, or I'm going to be like flooded or taken over. And then, so like, again, there's a very firm sense of like, I can't really let myself fully integrate. But that's, again, like that's the ideal endpoint of therapy, is that you can get into your other side and you can be a well-rounded person, right? Like there's times for me that I have to be competitive and assertive, and there's times for me to like, focus on my, my love relationships, and it doesn't matter about power or like my achievement, right? I can just be and belong with these people. And like, and that gives you the kind of most protection and insulation in life, right? You're not just putting all your eggs into this one basket, like where you can only be this one thing to people.
So there's an element of you approach. It's interesting, like being able to approach these parts of yourself as though they're not dangerous, not dangerous, but that they're not going to fuck everything up. Like,
but that's by definition, right? Like that's how they felt. They were
yeah,
overwhelming. You repressed them because they were overwhelming, and so like they're coded that way. Like they can't help but feel that way. And
yeah,
so like, it's only again by like me and like kind of getting close to them, me going through all this stuff with them, that at some point, like they can approach these giant overwhelming feelings with me, right, and like face them, like, and that's a a long process. Like I'm not talking like like 10-20 years, but I'm talking like at least like a few years. Like for anybody like who stays with me like past the symptom, past some of like the character work and into this level, like it's going to be a while. Like you didn't kind of put this character structure into place and like live it for multiple years without this being like a hard thing to undo, a hard thing to get to. And you have to again, like go through lots of sessions of transference to you, like where this person's like trying to put the bad stuff onto you, or they're idealizing you, right? Like, you have the perfect wife and perfect life at home, and they kind of see you in that way. But like at the end, like, it's to be able to get into feelings that were really big, really messy, really nasty, and it caused you to like get rid of a large part of your personality, like to like, suppress like a whole pole of what you are. Cause that's what we see. Like, like these people pleasers and people who have those problems, like they don't have access to their power side, and those narcissists that you see, like, that are unempathetic, right, and just are using people. Everything's like a transactional relationship where it's like, this person like is not my equal, but they flatter me and I'll keep them around. It's like, there's like a few women I worked with that like don't have any female friends because they're too competitive, and they have all these like male admirers that like hang out with them, that like feed their ego, and they want to sleep with them, right, and want to be with them and give them gifts. And it's just like, like that, like they're not able to just have, again, just like simple friendships with people where it's like, hey, like, I enjoy your company, you enjoy mine, you're funny, or I like these things about you. It's just like, like their sense of competition like takes away that whole aspect of life from them, so that they're, just being surrounded by the male admirers and these people, and like, again, like keeping themselves aloof from like social functions. Like, I was invited to this party, but it's not good enough for me to appear at, right? Like, or like I can't, be seen with these people. And so they're cultivating their image in that way. And so
Yeah.
like there's real like bad, huge feelings that got into them doing that and suppressing that other side. And you have to respect that. Like, things got really messy at some point, and to work to that point where they can let you like know that side of them, and go through that with them is a huge journey, and one that, like, again, not everybody can make. Like, not everybody feels like they're in that place to do it. And like, and oftentimes it's my own failings, like as a therapist, you know what I mean, that like I didn't see that this thing was a bigger deal that it was. And like you know or I got in too soon to some of this stuff, like when they weren't ready yet, and like learning to have that wisdom to know the pacing, like when they're ready to access this stuff, is like, that's the individual psychoanalyst, or psychotherapist like journey, is getting that feeling for different types of people, and knowing like when you can go in, even though you might see a bunch of material accumulating,
It sounds frustrating.
it's frustrating, like some sessions for sure, like, but like at the other time it's like, it's also what's like,
Yeah.
like beautiful, interesting about it, like and like, and like to learn this, and accumulate that, like, it's what you got to do if you love your work, you love your profession, and you want to become better at these things. Like there's definitely some types of people that I feel like I understand and can work with a lot better, and then there's other types that, like I still like, have that sense of like, okay, like, I should have called this person out sooner and been more active with them, in this way, and or like I said, I should have held back, and I shouldn't have like been so active, or this person, like, I think needed more, of the mirroring than I gave them. Like, but you learn that, and you make a mistake, and then you try to learn from that mistake, and get better.
It sounds like the work, as you're describing it, is um, making it feel as safe as possible and be as safe as possible for the client to start working towards and acknowledging very uncomfortable structures in themselves.
Yeah, I'm very uncomfortable feelings, and again, and it impulses, right? I mean, it's a very big thing. Like to get to that point where it's like you find the killer in yourself, right? Like, again, especially if you're like seeing yourself as like a good person, helpful, all these things, right? Like, and then like to have to go back to that place, like where like, no, like you could have killed somebody, right? Like, it's a very uncomfortable thing to have to see yourself as that. And so like, that's a long journey to get there, to the point that they can be comfortable enough with some of their power and assertiveness, and gradually get to that place like where they can see that, I am that Charles Manson that I had been dreaming about, and giving those dreams to you, and feeling like that repugnance for that person. I was him, and like I could have killed this person. Um, but like, uh, it's beautiful when it happens, and like when you're there and you can see like that person get to that place, and all the emotion that comes up with that. It's a I feel like it's a the those moments are like what sustained me in the job, because it's otherwise it's like it's relatively, you're isolated, you know what I mean, like in this you're in these rooms for like an hour piece with all these people like throughout the day, but just like and like and I don't know about other people, but like I guess I don't have good boundaries myself, like where I giving myself like space, I kind of see people back to back to back, and so I don't have much like interaction with colleagues and those things, and it kind of just feels like some days like I'm really in the grind of things, but like I still feel like that, like like there's those sessions that make it all feel like worth it, and like even if you have to be like in the background and like waiting with somebody, right, like there's still a lot of content that you can get into, like that there's still a lot of connections you can make, because like you're listening for the word choices they make, right, and you're like, oh, that word's come up again, like when they when they like use this phrase, and it's just like, and there's a music to it, and you're like, okay, like this is something like with this other person too, right, I can't work with it yet, I can't get them to get into it, but like you're constantly like making those little connections yourself, and waiting up for those points like where you can bring that material in, so
I feel, yeah.
it's not that frustrating is what I'm saying, like like
It's I may be frustrating. It requires a lot of patience, is perhaps because you're describing you're holding yourself back in certain ways.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I am, and I think that like I like was happy to get the training that I did with modern analysis, to like see and know how much I really had to do that, because otherwise I like I probably have that sense of guilt, right, like this person seeing me, they've been seeing me for like months, like their symptoms just still aren't getting better, like I'm not helping them, right, like I feel like I'm disposed to like have that kind of anxious feeling like with other people, like they're paying me all this money, right, like I should be giving them something. But then like if you try to do therapy that way, like you're gonna burn out, when again back to like the addicts, right, like when you're working with somebody, it's like the situations are atrocious, right, like a single mother of two who has like this boyfriend who's like living with her, she's working, he's not, so she has to work, pay for the apartment, take care of the kids who he has nothing to do with, and he's just like living off her for free, like eating her like money, like, or eating the food she buys with the money, right, like, and then just like and it's like, this is such an obviously bad toxic relationship, like why are you supporting this person, right, and if you just try to like deal with that person, tell them like, well, yeah, like look at all the ways he's bad, like you should leave him, right, like and trying to talk them and coach them into doing that, like you're gonna see that it's not gonna work and like it's gonna be frustrating, and they're just not gonna leave this person. It's only like when you have psychoanalytic knowledge and you're like, okay, like, well, what does this person represent for you, right, and like, so part of like I differentiate egoism and masochism in the sense that like that Freud does, like that the masochist, right, is like unconsciously identified with the sadist, right, and so just like, so that person, that guy you're with, who's like using you, like taking some of your diaper money for drugs, right, like treating you horribly in all these ways, but you're still staying with them, right, like what are you getting off of this, right, and it's like, and to find out, like, for example, that boyfriend, like the way that he's bad in these different ways that you can see, and then getting into like how you used to see yourself as bad in that way. so he's representing this negative self-evaluation you have of yourself because you screwed people over in the past. You saw yourself as bad and you project that into him. And so instead of having to live with your conscience all the time, like, I'm a shitty person, I betrayed, like, my friend slept with her boyfriend, right, and did all these things, and I'm a shitty person, you externalize it, right, project it into him, and you're living with him as the representation of, like, the badness in you, and you feel like you deserve it in some way, like you deserve the treatment from him. But if you get back into the guilt that you had for how you treated others in the past and work through that, right, in therapy, then you don't need him anymore. You don't need this negative presence, like, in your life, and you can get past it. But again, like, if you're just working, like, cognitively, like, what are the pro and con lists of staying with him and leaving him, right? If you're just doing those things and trying to coach him, like, you're not getting to what you need to get to. And if you are in that place, like, where you're just going to be, like, saying, like, why aren't you being logical? Why aren't you, like, listening? Like, I imagine those people get really burnt out. I mean, I saw them get burnt out at the clinics I was working at. You know, it's like they're working in, like, the, inpatient addiction, or they're working with these other people and they're just not making the changes. They're just not, setting themselves up to succeed. And it's just like, and you're pointing out the logic of, like, hey, people, places, things, right? If you hang around your friends who are still using, you're probably going to use, right? Like, it's probably going to happen. So, like, you got to change those things. And they're, again, like, they're right ideas, but just like, but they don't stop to ask, like, well, what is this person getting from hanging out with these other people who are still using, right? Like, if he's trying to hang out with them because he wants to fix them, right? He wants to help them, and you're just telling him that he can't do it, like, he's not going to be able to be himself. Like, he needs to be a fixer or a helper, right? And get involved with these other people. And so, like, you have to work with it in a different kind of way to avoid it. I mean, give me a sense. I mean, like, how much frustration do you have with working with some of the clients you do?
I wasn't expected to be asked a question. I'm a relatively new therapist. I've been out of grad school for, just over 2 years. And I would say that, in my graduate training with internship and, since I started working, there's been a good deal, but a decreasing amount of frustration. Particularly in my practicum, which was like the first clinical experience at all. I was working at a clinic for people with eating disorders. And at that point, I really had no interest in any type of depth-oriented therapy. I was almost exclusively interested in cognitive behavioral models. And I would get really incredibly frustrated in kind of that way of just like, this person knows what they need to do. Why don't they do it? And over, the years, there's been less frustration with more understanding around that of how little, conscious awareness we have over what we're doing, and that our agency isn't at the seat of consciousness, all the time. That we're compromised in that way. And
But
then,
that's Freud's drives, right? Like, we're not choosing, like, rational, autonomous people saying, like, you know what, I think out of all the lives I could live, the best life is to have the life of, like, somebody who's successful in achieving. It's like, no, you feel that way. You're driven, egoistically to, like, be a power person that way. And you're not choosing it. You can try to rationalize it about, like, why you're this way, but, like, but we are driven fundamentally and driven socially, right, to have these interactions with others. And just, and so if you're, like, starting with the idea that we're the rational, autonomous chooser, it's just like, it's backwards, right? Like,
yeah.
And if you're trying to think that has, like, so much power, like, you're not getting to the sense of, like, well, like, we're social animals, we're driven in these ways. And we, like, that idea of, like, the, ego and superego and id, right? like the ego is really has like very little power in that. Like the ego, in those caricatures, right, is like sitting on the elephant, right, or sitting on, the wild horse, and it's just like, and like those drives are taking us out there, and it's like you can see, like sometimes like like use reason and logic to see like, okay, I objectively I can see this is what's going on, right? I can see how this friend I have, right, is kind of selfish, and they're probably like using me, or this person is that kind of way. But like even when you objectively can see that, doesn't mean it feels any different, right? It doesn't mean that like you still like you can see it that way, and it solves everything, and you can just be like, oh, I'm like rationally it makes sense for me to not be their friend. It's like you see tons of people in toxic or abusive relationships, and they can get all this insight into it, but they won't leave it.
I think that's why people get that idea in their head of people don't change. That like that's something. That's a saying. There's also the saying people change. But I think the reason that people get into their head that people don't change is because people have failed many times in just telling someone to change and not seeing that change happen because um, that's not how we work. We're more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say that like that's the a point like objective point I try to get to with some other people, right? Which like when we're doing individual therapy, and then they have their friend or boyfriend or girlfriend, whoever it is in their life, it's just like, okay, like you are getting healthier, you can see that, like you're standing up for yourself more, or you're more able to do this or that, and this other person, like unless they get into therapy, like they're probably not going to change. You're probably going to outgrow them, and sometimes it's enough that like say if you're working with the echoist who's like not speaking up for themselves enough, they start to do that, and then the other person might respond, right, and kind of be like, okay, like yes, like you're right, this isn't fair of me to treat you this way, or I'll stop doing these things, and it can work. But for a lot of people it just it just doesn't, and then that person's asking for a second chance, asking, like just like the addict too, right? Like this time is the last time, like I'm not going to use drugs again, or I'm not going to do this. And it's like, well, how many times have you said that? Like, why should anybody believe you, right? And so like for me, it's like unless you're like that other person's like going into therapy themselves, like they can say all that, but they won't change.
And they might believe that when they're saying it.
Yeah, that some of them can. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not like they're all just bald faced lying, right? And they know they're not. Like, they could have super good intentions. Like, I want to be this better person. I want to be a person who makes you feel more loved or cared for. But just like but uh, it's very hard for them to actually put that into practice, and it's like, and they have to show that they're doing that work. Otherwise, like, how many times do they get to say that this is the last time? How many times do they get to say like, I'll be different, I'll be better, right?
So we should start wrapping up because if I don't have my second cup of coffee of the day, I'm gonna be a mess. But before we start closing out, I'm wondering if there's anything that we didn't get to today, or that feels like we should give attention to, or that we didn't spend enough time with, or anything like that.
I mean, I don't have a sense of like, oh, I'm burning to talk about this. Like, I'm always writing something new, and there's always like things that are like, say, my pet interest right now in the moment. But I would say like, like maybe like going back to the beginning, right? Like if that sense of like the education you got on psychoanalysis and the way it was like mischaracterized, right? And is there anything else to say about like, like another common thing, right, is like penis envy, right? Or something like that, where it's just like, that thing that is attributed to Freud that's like, for lots of people, right, it's just patently false. Like, this is pseudoscience. Like, this is just, maybe like Freud was obsessed with penises, but I'm not, right? Like, and just, so is there anything else that you got there that you felt like in your formal education or your on psychoanalysis that,
I, why is the iceberg model a bad? Why is that drawing bad? Because people are like
bad?
that. Yeah, people are like that's not a good representation. That I don't know if that's how you feel, but that is my
Why
question.
do they say it's not a good representation?
I don't know. I thought maybe you would feel that way, and that's my question. I get so if that
I don't know.
feels
I
like
mean,
maybe that.
there's a lot of psychoanalysts. Okay. Well, because I was going to say, like, a lot of them have their thing of like, oh, the iceberg model, like, or oh, like, Freud didn't say instinct, he said drive, and they'll like take something and they'll make like a lot of it. But it's just like, I mean, the iceberg model can work again, as long as you're saying all these things that are going on. Cause right, like we talked about the superego, and it's just like, so there, at the top, you can have those access to those, self negative self criticisms, right? And you're aware of them. Like the superego can go to the top of the iceberg, right? But then when you're identified with the parental object, right, and you're in that place of narcissism or egoism, like you're not aware that you're doing that. Like you're not aware that you identified with it and that's going on. You're in that place, and again, you just feel like I should be perfect all the time, or I should be seen as perfect, right? Or I should be good all the time, like or other people have to see me this way, and if they don't, it bothers me, right? It really is like an attack on my ego. So it's just like that stuff is what the superego is going on beneath that water too, right? And it's like we know that it's in that kind of relation. So I mean, like you can make something of that model if you want to. Just like I said, just like if you're just gonna be like, it wants ice cream cone,
Okay,
superego
so let
says
me
no
ask.
to your diet.
Let me ask in that way then. Because I think you did a great job of kind of explaining what the superego is. And uh, I forget the name of the article, but there's one of the two articles that of yours that I read. You really you really explicate what the ego is very well, and one of the things that you also state is like it's also kind of yourself as you experience yourself, among other things. Um, what is the id if not that part of us that just wants to eat ice cream and punch and kick and have sex?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I try to show in the article, right? Like I see it as like, it's often mischaracterized as just like it's like the brutal caveman that lives inside of us. And exactly those words, right? The caveman wants to smash like hit some woman over the head, drag her back to like his cave and rape her, right? Like, and will fight with other guys, like, but that's like kind of the caveman side, but there's also the angel side, like, where it's just like you could have like these sentiments of like, wanting to see like, your parents in this ideal way, right? Like mom's been such a, like, been so like loving to me, and like I'm grateful to her and I owe her so much, right? And it's just like in that sense of like seeing her in like a weakened state, right? That she like, say gets sick or something bad happens to her, like where it's like your heart feels like so much for seeing her in that state. Like you want to like lift her up. You want to, I like see her in this ideal way. And then you have this sense of like, like I said, like these affectionate or restorative impulses, like where you want to like see her as strong as she was when you fell in love with her, or felt that way towards her, and there's like,
And that comes from the id as well.
yeah, that's like it. So in the article, I'm careful to say, like, Freud mentions aggression, which is the obvious thing, right? Wanting to cannibalize others, like dismember them, castrate them, behead them, do all these things, right? That we see in all these movies and myths. But then the other side too is like, this, the side of wanting to like restore them and see them in these forms, like you can say with magical thinking, right? Like you could have somebody give somebody else the evil eye. Right? They like do something and then that other person's supposed to have something bad happen. But then you have also the side of like energy healing, right? Like where like, like I have lots of say anxious carrying echoists, right? Where it's like, oh, my son went on a trip and he's driving for like 10 hours and it's like, and I'm sending him like my positive energy. So like nothing happens to him. Right. Or I'm praying for him. Like all those impulses, like are in us too. Right. And so
So
just like,
sorry.
no, I was just going to say
But
like, we're just a certain type of psychoanalyst, right? That and that like is as bad as like the layman who's like only seeing all this negative and doesn't want to acknowledge this other side in Freud's writing, like of how important eros and love is, and all these things are. But they're there too.
Would it be fair to say the id is pure want, both positive and negative want?
Well, so I mean that brings us into the question of like a symptom, right? Like, so if we take something like, that you're dieting and you want to eat ice cream, right? Like that. So in some ways, you could have like this can manifest as the id, right? Like that. So for a lot of people I work with who have say stuff with food in that way, like that uh, hidden within it is like are some of these affectionate like relationships, like like that. So for example, like I'll take some of the food that they like to eat, like what's some of your favorite foods, right? And I'll say like, okay, like, so if we anthropomorphize the food, like give it a human personality, like how do you imagine that it feels about you? Like obviously it doesn't, it's just food, but like, but like that's part of how the this is, right? Like you can see it in Beauty and the Beast, that the clock comes to life, right? All these things, like Freud talks about it in the uncanny, right? Like we have horror movies like where a doll comes to life and does these things. So in a certain strata of the unconscious, right, there's a sense of like we can take an object and that object is like human, but also an inanimate object, and they're kind of commensurate value, right? Like that, like the object that we take is not further differentiated as it will be in later development, that it's like a specific type of human object. It's just an object in this general sense of like, I can see that there's this thing in front of me, and this thing can be human. This thing can be the lamp in front of me. It can be like an animal, right? Like just all these things. And then so when you have the person who's there with the anthropomorphized food object, right? Like they can be in identification with the parental imago again. So, say like in egoism, we talked almost exclusively like being the good parent, but there's also being the dead parent, and like dead as defined, right, as like not as detached, empty, not really present, not really here, right? Like, and so they're on the side of the say being empty as the dead parent, and then so the food is a representation of them like wanting to enliven the dead parent, right? So they're as the dead parent, they feel empty. They want to fill this emptiness up with something, and then when you anthropomorphize the food is like, hey, like I want you to be happy. I want to make you feel good. I want to cheer you up, right? Like, and it has like, and they'll give it this personality. Again, it's totally illogical, but like how they kind of like a part of them feels about how the food would see them. And then if you can reverse that and get that back to like, when did they have all this happiness and love energy, right? And they saw the dead person in their lives who they had to resurrect or restore. And then like if they can work through that, then they're not going to be in the empty place anymore. Right. So it's like, that sense of like that affectionate relation, right? Like that's in there. It's not just like pure sloth and gluttony, right? Like I'm this insatiable pit and I just want to eat and fill myself with everything and have everything. Like that's the power based side, right? That's the power, sense of like, when you have a kid, you can have that, like, I want to eat all my birthday cake. Like, screw you. I don't want to share with any of my friends at the party. I want to have all these. And when my friends come over, right, I want to play all with all my toys and I'll let them play with any, like, that's power. Like me, this is mine. But like, that's not the end of the story. And so when you get into that affectionate side and these different impulses, you're working through that. And like, and then you're starting to see like, okay, like, so this person wants to diet, but if they feel empty, if they're identified with the dead parent, right, they feel empty, like they don't have the assertiveness, they don't have the aggression. Like it's very easy for them to get to that place of like, I don't care anymore, right? Like I had a hard day at work, like, screw it, I don't care. Where other people, right, like, their stuff with food is like, they can be very controlled and they can be like, I count my calories, I do this, and they can bring their power side totally to bear on that stuff. But like a lot of these people like that are binge eaters or have these problems, it's like, again, they're on the egoist side and they're not power people. So if you're trying to talk to them in that way and work through it that way, like here's your strategy to do these things, it's just like they'll get to their emptiness, they'll get to their deadness, and there's idea of not wanting to care, and then they want to have that little bit of aliveness that food gives them, because like again, it was a tough day. I deserve to have like a little bit of aliveness, even though this is going to go with ultimately my negative self criticisms, right? Of like of like, you're fat, like you're ugly, nobody likes you, right? Like whatever it is. So like, the superego is there to criticize. The superego is there in the sense of like the parental object, right? And the ego can see some of these things, right? Like, you can give them this logic, these reasons, but like again, the ego is not just like, conscious logic and reason that you can see. It's also these ego drives, right? Like to go out into the world in these ways, like, for this, to say that you have this like overweight social worker, like she's going out and she's being like, again, the good parent to like all these people that she's working with, she's listening to them, she's trying to help them. Right. And then like when she gets home, she's exhausted, she gets to her underlying deadness. Right. And then she just wants to eat, right. Just wants to have that pint of Ben and Jerry's and oftentimes dissociate with it, like that these people will like eat a bunch of food that initially tastes good, but then their body's like digesting it and they're like laying like a corpse on the couch, like not really being very present, not really being, say, in their minds or their bodies very much, right? They're just kind of like spending all this energy digesting. They're watching some mindless like TV, and they're almost like kind of acting out like that dead object in the sense that you could look at their lives and be like, there's not much life here. There's not much dynamic quality to it. They're not going out and doing a bunch of things. Like there is strong deadness here.
But the actual eating is, it sounded initially like an attempt to restore the dead
One
parental
of many
imago.
things, right? One of many things that is going on there. Like, so when we start to undo the stuff that's involved with it, like, yes, like they're in identification with the dead parent, the dead parental imago. The food is supposed to be like them restoring the deadness to life, right? But then just but also, for them to be in this situation, there's also that sense of like, that they got gym memberships, but they never follow through with them, right? That they like New Year's resolution, I'm going to stop eating, and then they don't do that, right? And then there's like not just one relationship to the food. Like sometimes there's going to be that sense of like the super ego sense of punishment, right? Like that, along with being the dead parental imago, like you could have that sense of like their mom was overweight, and in some ways, like by doing this, like they're becoming just like their mom, who they were angry at and they don't want to be like. And then you like, once you work through that affectionate side, then you're gonna have to see like maybe there's some angry side stuff going on. Well, I mean, there is always going to be in a symptom, like the two poles are working. So then it's just like you have to get to that sense of getting them to their anger, so they can undo this identification with their mom, that they're punishing themselves by making themselves be like their overweight mom. So never just one thing. Like the unconscious is always like anything that's a symptom. I always explain it as like there's a knot, like that there's like at least 2 feeders, like strings going in to make this knot in there. And sometimes there's 3 or 4 strings that are all coming in, and we got to like work with it. Like, say we worked with the affection and that side of it. Now it's like, okay, like, so how did you do with food this week? And it's like, oh, okay, I was still eating, binge eating. I was able to control it more, because I didn't have this one part of it giving me this urge, driving me out to do it. Then it's like, okay, so then like, let's talk about that. Like, when did you notice that you felt the cravings the most? Morning, afternoon, night, what social situations, like, did you interact with that kind of like right away you needed to eat that cheeseburger on the way home because it stressed you out so much. Right. And then so we're going back and forth between like, well, what are the id components of this symptom? And then what are some of the ego interactions with others, right, that are kind of bringing up this anxiety, bringing up this like these negative evaluations that again want to push that person to eat and not face this stuff, right, to escape it. Like it's like they make their own coping mechanisms, right, for dealing with their life. They're just really negative, right? So once you can like find these things and go through them, like there's a lot, and there's many forms of the id, many forms of the superego that are all involved in that. And again, the ego, interpersonal relationships being driven in certain ways too, that you have to start to undo, to like work through and find like where they defended in these ways in the past. And that's the meat of therapy, you know.
So we should wrap up, but if somebody wanted to hear more or read more about what you have to say about the meat of therapy, how therapy works, how people change, where could they find you?
Um, so I mean, I would say that my first book is like all theory. Like I didn't use any clinical examples. It was kind of just like, you know, my studies at the graduate school I was in, and trying to say like, well, this is like how I'm seeing like kind of again that system, that model of Freud coalesce across all these articles and all these all of his writings. And then from there, I got to the point where it's like, you know, I was like, well, I have to give like the evidence for this. Like, I don't want to just be saying like Freud is right, you know, or like just like, you know, saying these things in the abstract. Like, yeah, I want to share my clinical realities. And so the second book, Psychoanalysis and Hidden Narrative in Film, I kind of start to introduce some of these clinical techniques to show all these identifications and how to undo them. Um, and then in the other articles, like so there's two: the Narcissism and Egoism one, and the one on the Oedipus complex in the International Journal of Controversial Discussions. And like and that's an online journal, so they're free on there. You don't have to buy them, and they have some clinical examples in there. But to say like, you know, this whole thing, like, you know, the first, second, third phase of therapy, and going through the whole thing, I don't have a say like a book on pure clinical technique where I'm say walking writers through that. It's just, you know, I'm just sharing thoughts of like what I see in my practice, and maybe I'll write a clinical like technique book at some point. But like but just for right now, it's like I'm working on primary narcissism and like the early stages of development, and like how they show up in fantasies, and how they show up in ego structure, you know. And that's kind of like just from working with all the defenses of getting into the feelings that come up. It's like, you know, that's the realm that most occupies them now, is like is to kind of, you know, make sense of in a formal way, like, well, why does this person produce this image? Like, you know, why are, you know, when I get them to associate to where the feeling is in their body, and they give me like a two-dimensional sheet of paper, right? Like why would they give me that image? And like, and how does it show up again in development? Like, where there's some kind of stage of 2D images, you know, that we see in the world, where we're not seeing like fully 3D binocular vision with things, you know, like that's a stage of the ego's perceptual consciousness that it only sees in that way. And so like that area, I think, is like, you know, like poorly understood in Freud, poorly understood in psychoanalysis in general. And just like, and if I could find some way to get all those things together, I think, you know, I'll have a important contribution to make with that, you know. And also, like, I don't have many colleagues. Like I'm in Wyoming, and like I said, my degree is like, I got a degree in psychoanalytic counseling, and a degree, like a doctorate in psychoanalysis and culture. But then I've like found, you know, like in Wyoming, I'm probably like the only person who's like really interested in psychoanalysis here. And then I found out on top of that just like you know, that even though like interest in psychoanalysis like has diminished greatly, you know, institutes have closed, like there's less and less candidates every year, right? All that stuff. I found that like, because I'm not like a formal IPA, like International Psychoanalytic Association trained analyst, that like other analysts who are like, you're not a legitimate analyst, you know. Even though all my writings are about Freud, I think exclusively in like these psychoanalytic models, right? Like, you know, like put out these books and publications, they're like, you're not a real psychoanalyst. So like, so some of the colleagues that
Well, that's what they said to Lacan, so I don't think you have to worry
yeah.
too much about that.
Well, I don't know. I would say that, like, you know, ideally, like, I would like to have like that community, right?
Yeah.
And share some of these things, hear what's working for other people and how they handle like a moment in the transference, right? And just like, and have that in my life, like, where it's like, you know, like I talk shop with other colleagues about that stuff. But just, they're, but my sense is like, that a lot of psychoanalysts are kind of, you know, uh, very much are prey to like the in-group and out-group mentality, right? Like I'm the legitimate analyst, where somebody who's doing Lacanian psychoanalysis is not a legitimate like analyst, right? Like there's like this infighting, these ways of like representing the other people as like missing what's important in psychoanalysis, or like some people are even like, well, that way of working with somebody like can make the client go psychotic, like they say all these things, and so just like, you'd expect psychoanalysts to be more aware of these things and like more introspective, but they aren't, like, they are equally prey to these polarizations, to getting, having some of their narcissism being like, I'm the true psychoanalyst, right? And everybody else is not. And so just, I'd say like, when I get to that point where I have more of a, like some more community and colleagues like set up, and maybe I'm trying to actually like have these conversations and think through them more, like maybe at some point I'll get to like a clinical technique book or something, but it's just not, something that I've thought about doing, or have like intentions to do right now. But hopefully, again, the free writings at the International Journal of Controversial Discussions, like the people would be able to see like a lot of these examples of undoing the identifications, of working with the id through the body and through the imagination to discharge it, as opposed to, again, like waiting for it to come up in the transference and like waiting for the person to get, discharge their anger to you as the bad object, you know what I mean, in that moment. And again, super important to do, but not the only way to do it. And you're often like turning analysis into like long periods of waiting if you're not being more active,
I would say the clinical vignettes in your article are really interesting and, just as a clinician, helpful, showing like, okay, well, what could this look like, in a way that is not just, and this continued for several months and then suddenly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, everything comes down to that sense of like, if you become the parental object, then your interpersonal relationships have to look a certain way. And then you have all these like, unsatisfying interactions with others, like, based upon like, again, you needing them to see you in this way, or you being unable to be there for them in this other way because you are in that identification. And so so these vignettes are like really good for like, here's a specific straightforward interaction. Here are the statements that the person has about it, for like the self-criticisms for themselves, or how they imagine the other person looks at them, right? And then you can undo that, or get back to what it was originally. And just like the power of that, again, is like, for me, is like, been really impressive. Like, like I wouldn't have been able to write about like, echoism and the dead object or the good object and these things without having these specific real life little examples that like are undergirded by that in the unconscious, in these unconscious superego identifications. And when you can see how much that is at work in somebody's life, like then you get the impression of how much of that iceberg is under the water, right? Like how much like they're being driven in these ways, they need to be seen in these ways, and that's hugely impressive. Like that how little choice we really have in life, like for like what we're going to do or how we're going to interact. Like it's not just like, oh, you need to stand up for yourself and say something. It's like, just if you just ask the person to say that and do those things, like they won't, like, and if you keep on pushing on it, like they'll run away from therapy. If you're like going to be like, you just have to say no to say no. And that's what, like all these like other therapists are, is like, they're basically like life coaches, which is like, I'm going to have to try to motivate you and inspire you, like not just, use logic and reason, but just like, how do I get you to like really animated and like get like incensed that you're going to go home and you're going to finally tell your boyfriend like it's over,
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, you can do it that way. Just like in real life, you could have friends who treat you that way. Right. And then you do it and you kind of go in and you break up with your boyfriend, and then like you have a cathartic moment of like, shit, like I did this, like, and like, you know what I mean? And that it can be sometimes enough to undo that identification, right? And kind of get into like those feelings. But not everyone's gifted, like, as a life coach, to be, or like a motivational speaker, or somebody to inspire others. Right. And then those people with like certain other people, like, they can't get into like their pathology. Like they just don't know how to deal with like the, autistic person, or some of these people who have certain defenses, that they're not prey to like, the charisma of their life coach,
Mm,
and then
yeah.
like and that's like where like that psychoanalytic knowledge, takes you beyond just like the normal appearances of things, and takes you into this, again, this deeper realm of like primary narcissism of autism, and like some of the defenses and identifications that undergird that. And those are like I said, like where most of my focus is going these days, is to like understand like those deepest resistances, those deepest detachments from feeling, those deepest things that like get in the way of the person accessing their emotions and their id in the way that they need to.
Well, I'm gonna link to your currently available writing in the
Sure.
show, and I'm looking forward to what you produce next.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
All right, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you're listening on a podcast app, please leave a rating. It helps a lot. Thanks.